They found an old man alone in the tower, wearing no badge, carrying no papers. The guards called him a trespasser until the radio played a voice last heard in 1972. Arthur Langley was 84. He sat on the catwalk above the control room, hands folded like a man who had learned to keep something close. A junior guard caught sight of him and froze. The guard's radio already in his palm. The word trespasser barely formed on his tongue. The guard climbed the steps. "You need to come down." The voice was thin and formal, following a script. The words hit the metal like a thrown stone. Arthur did not move. He looked at the rows of panels and dials as if they were old friends. A shift sergeant arrived, hair cropped and shoulders level with command. "Who are you?" The question sounded like a ledger entry. Arthur folded his cap into his hands and gave a single name. Arthur Langley, 84. Silence unfolded like a brief instruction. The sergeant called for identification. Arthur produced nothing, only a photo tucked in the lining of his coat. The photo was a corner of another life, sepia and creased, a scuffed bomber and a faded crew, a patch glinting like a smole. Stubborn fire. Someone in the log room mentioned a date, 1972, and a face that had been on a base bulletin years ago. A trainee looked up, memory snagged on a tale told in canteens, about a pilot who had come back from the brink. The name in the ledger made the trainee swallow, his knuckles whitening on the pen. An officer thumbed through an old radio transcript and found a clipped line. A voice reported, as calm under strain. "Play it." A technician worked with care, as if the sound could be handled gently. The speakers gave nothing like music, only breath and static. And then a phrase that fit the throat of an old man in the room. The trainee heard it, and his knee hit the tile. A small collapse of surprise. He said the voice matched. The room shifted. Bearings loosened. The sergeant looked at Arthur as if the man might be a map with half its roots erased. Arthur's eyes closed for a breath. The slight lift at the corner of his mouth, like a salute to a remembered hazard. He did not argue. He did not volunteer a story. He kept his silence as if it were ballast. The trainee kept asking who had been saved and why a file would be missing. And the question hung, too heavy for the ticking clock in the tower. They led Arthur away from the catwalk, hands respectful but firm, and the guard walked by him with the rigid courtesy of someone who had read orders. In the corridor, the logbook lay open, its pages waiting with neat pen strokes, a name half revealed, and a date that would not leave the room. A faded insignia caught the sergeant's eye, a tiny echo of something older. The ledger kept its secret. The trainee's hand trembled as he closed the ledger, the motion deliberate, as if hiding a page. The sergeant stared at the photo, lines in his face tightening like a drawn wire. A technician carried the reel into the small office, fingers careful as if handling a relic. He set the tape to play, and the room leaned in, the sound cutting like a thread through cotton. Static filled the pause. Then a voice that belonged to no music spoke a direction with a calm that did not match the man before them. Ellis touched his throat as if to check a pulse, memory snagging on a tale from the mess. He said the name aloud, Arthur Langley, and the ledger on the sergeant's desk made a small sound like a settling ship. The sergeant looked at the photograph and then at the patch. The phoenix curled like a promise that had been smudged. Lieutenant Harris entered, his steps measured and deliberate. A man shaped by procedure rather than sentiment. Harris ran a finger down the ledger and halted where the service number should be, the page looking as if a hand had erased a tooth from it. He asked how a man without papers knew the call signs and the protocol for the tower. A corporal set 2 cups of tea on the desk and said nothing, his silence a kind of truce. Ellis spoke then, not from rank but from a knot of family memory. He said the pilot who was saved was his uncle. The words made the room narrow, the official distance changing in a single breath. Harris ordered a records check, and the technician tapped keys until the screen filled with names and blanks. The database showed a gap where Arthur's number should have been, a hollow that felt deliberate and not clerical. Harris noted the omission, and his jaw tightened. the line of his speech shortening like a snapped cable. A corporal produced a clipped newspaper, margins browned, an article about a near miss in 72. Ellis read the line and paused on a phrase that matched the tape. The same instruction called calm and steady. The overlap turned rumor into evidence, and evidence into a problem the base could not ignore. Someone suggested detaining Arthur while inquiries continued. The suggestion practical and blunt. Harris hesitated, then refused, balancing consequence with the face in front of him, a man who sat with his hands folded. Arthur moved only to tap the inside of his coat where the photograph had been kept, a small gesture of possession rather than protest. Ellis left to trace relatives while the technician made copies of the photograph, movements efficient and ritual. The sergeant watched Arthur with the look of a man who had kept problems small, but his eyes held a question no file could answer. Papers shuffled, the ledger closed with a deliberate hand, and the gap in the records remained an accusation without an author. Harris tapped a pen and spoke of protocol, his voice steady but tight. He ordered an archive search for anyone who might remember that sortie. The office filled with small noises of investigation, and a single question moved like a shadow. Who had reason to erase a man now? They wheeled a playback machine into the office and set the reel with a careful hand. The tape clicked, and the room leaned in as if it were a single body holding its breath. Static unspooled. Then a voice arrived, flat and steady, a man speaking through distance and years. Ellis went pale and stepped back, the name on his lips fragile. He said the voice was Arthur's, and the word hit the room like a stone. Lieutenant Harris sat still, his face an ordered thing that had to make room for surprise. Harris asked for a repeat, and the technician obliged with steady fingers. The phrase played again, clipped and calm, the language of someone used to directing lives. A corporal rubbed his temple, and the sergeant stared at the floor. The air tightened. A junior officer said that if the voice was genuine, they had a procedural problem. He spoke of missing records and the risk of scandal, clinical words that made suspicion spread. The suggestion felt like a soft accusation, aimed not at Arthur, but at whoever had arranged the gaps. Arthur watched without alarm, hands folded as if holding a small ledger of memory. He did not explain. His silence was measured and contained, a thing that resisted cheap sympathy. Ellis felt family memory press against the room's official machinery. Harris ordered a deeper archive search and rang central records. The technician tapped keys until the screen populated, and then showed blanks, holes like missing teeth. Harris pointed and said this was no clerical error. A corporal fetched a service ledger and ran a thumb along columns of neat ink, names lined like vessels in a harbor. Where Arthur's number should be, the ink had been rubbed until digits blurred. The smear looked deliberate, not the pale accident of time. An officer asked who had access to the ledgers in the post-war years, and the question landed with no answer. Silence in that moment felt less like respect and more like a shifting of responsibility. The idea that someone had removed a man from the books cooled the room. Ellis stood and spoke with a force that belied his rank. He demanded to know why a voice could be real and a record absent. Harris listened, his hand tightening on a pen, and then warned that rushing to judgment risked careers and reputation. His caution read as strategy rather than compassion. A clerk fetched a microfilm reader, and the office bent over grainy frames. They found a clipped report that matched the tape, and an entry noting a phoenix-shaped patch. The patch name made a low sound in the room, a recognition like a bell underwater. Harris ordered they question anyone who might remember that sortie. He set names and contacts and a search that would reach beyond the office. The technician packed the reel with steady hands, and the ledger was closed with a deliberate motion. One question remained stubborn and small. If the voice was Arthur's and his service number erased, who had reason to remove a man from his own story? Harris convened the officers in the small briefing room, faces folding into business as if the room itself had rehearsed restraint. Files were set like stakes on the table, small proofs to test a wider claim. The mood tightened, a slow pressure that made movements precise. A battered folder was opened, and the Phoenix insignia was visible in a faded photograph. The emblem, a quiet outrage against forgetting. A corporal pointed, and the name for the patch moved through the room without flourish. The ledger that had been closed was brought back and thumped on the table, the sound like a verdict. Harris spoke of procedure and of reputations, his voice level rather than loud. He suggested caution, the language of a man who knew where consequences gathered. The sergeant watched Arthur in the doorway, his eyes narrowing in calculation. Someone produced a sheet stamped top secret, and the edge had been smoothed, as if to remove a fold. The paper suggested interference, a manual erasure rather than decay. A junior officer said that tampering files was a serious accusation, and the word felt heavy in the room. Ellis shifted and offered a detail that cut the room further. He said his uncle had mentioned a small unit that vanished from official lists. The name the uncle used matched the emblem, and the mention landed like a new bolt. Conversation pivoted from curiosity to alarm, and the room contracted. Harris ordered contact with central files and units that might hold the missing records. He set tasks across ranks with a hand that left no ambiguity about authority. The orders were precise, almost surgical. A clerk returned with microfilm, and the room leaned into the tiny frames, as if the glass held confession. The film showed an operation log and a scrawled note that a squadron number had been removed. The line was short and stark, a bureaucratic excision that read like a decision. The sergeant's jaw worked, and he said they would need witnesses, living names to make the paper real again. Harris named a list that reached into neighboring bases, and to men who might now be old. The list felt like a net cast across memory. Arthur stood when called, and moved with the slow dignity of a man who knew steps by muscle. He spoke once, a sentence measured and plain that carried the weight of a man who had seen more than he said. The words changed nothing on paper, but they shifted the room's moral weight. A young clerk found a remark in a dispatch that hinted at a cover decision from higher authority. The phrase suggested motive rather than accident, and motive sharpened suspicion into accusation. The officers exchanged looks that meant business rather than curiosity. Harris closed the briefing with orders to proceed and a warning that containment was necessary until facts were clear. The men left in a line that looked like purpose rather than ritual. Ellis watched the ledger as if it might speak. The ledger lay open again, and the blank where a number had been remained, an accusation without an author. They brought a man from the veterans list, and the office held its breadth. Thomas Avery was 79, voice thin but present, a pilot whose name had been whispered at reunions for decades. He walked with a stick and a memory that fitted the ledger like a key. Thomas sat opposite Arthur and looked at him for a long beat, as if confirming a photograph with the hand. He said he had been brought back from a spin in 1972 by a voice that steadied the sky. The room found weight in the sentence, the sound settling like dust into pattern. Ellis stepped forward, a nephew with a claim and a need, and asked Thomas to say what he remembered. Thomas spoke slow and exact. He named a maneuver and an altitude and a call sign that matched the tape. The detail landed cold and precise, and doubt thinned into something that had edges. Harris closed his eyes for a moment, as if to check the horizon, then opened them to business. He said they had proof in voice and in recollection. Proof that did not sit with the paperwork. His voice did not triumph. It folded fact into duty. Thomas looked at the photograph Arthur had kept and nodded, the motion small and absolute. He said the patch had been a promise, then a problem, then removed from books by command. The admission made the officers still, the word command heavier than any file. A clerk read aloud from a recovered dispatch, a line that suggested a political choice rather than clerical decay. The phrase named an order to suppress association with the squadron, citing a sensitivity no one in that room could yet explain. Motive crystallized into something colder than oversight. Arthur finally spoke, his voice steady as a compass. He said they had done what was needed that night and accepted whatever followed. The restraint in his tone changed the room, not with anger, but with an old, hard peace. The statement reframed accusation as consequence. Harris stood and did something that had little precedent. He asked for an official note of apology and a quiet recognition to be prepared. The order was modest and precise, designed to mend memory rather than headline. It was a choice that put a man's dignity back into the ledger. Thomas reached across and laid his hand over Arthur's, the gesture small and ceremonial in its simplicity. Men in the room cleared their throats, and the sergeant allowed a thin, restrained approval to show. Respect settled like a seal. Files were marked for restricted review, and names were sent to neighboring posts. A search that would make gaps visible or prove them deliberate. Yet one line in the dispatch remained unanswered, a directive without an origin. The office had done its part, the witness had spoken, and the veteran had his quiet measure of justice. But the question of who ordered the erasure still waited in paper and memory. Sometimes the loudest acts of courage leave no record at all. But if you listen long enough, in the hum of an old control tower, you can still hear a voice steadying the sky and a name that history tried to forget.